Thanks for listening to the Forest Ramble podcast. Please subscribe and leave a review on your podcast provider, as this helps other Forest supporters find our content. Now on with the pod. Go back in time 25 years. Forest were in what is now called the Championship. Brian Clough had just left as the manager. And since then, Forest have had 21 permanent managers and countless caretakers. I'm Rich Ferraro, and in this special Forest Ramble podcast, we look at the fortunes of those gaffers, and I'm joined by Stephen Toplis, hello.
Hello.
And the Maradona the Midlands, hi.
Hi.
Well, hi indeed. It's been a turbulent 25 years or so. Forest have been up, they've been down, they've gone down again, they've come up again, and then they've stayed resolutely mediocre in the last 10 years. And astonishingly, the turnover of managers has been, if you include the caretakers, has been more than one a year. Stephen, why do you think that is?
There's been no plan. There's been no joined up thinking. There's been some terrible managers come through the door in that time. There's been some good ones, but they haven't been given the opportunity to do the job properly. And it's just been an endless revolving door of long ball, passing, youth, old-timers, club legends, complete unknowns. It's just had a bit of everything. And yeah, we wouldn't have it any other way.
and Maradona the Midlands, I think it's important to remember that the game and the sport and the industry has changed a huge amount in that time as well.
Yeah, it's not just Forest that have gone through lots of managers. It's become the norm really throughout football. There's been pressures on Forest, such as financial pressures, which have contributed to it, and the need for success after such a prolonged period of relative failure. That brings its own pressures. But yeah, it's been an interesting time, I suppose.
And the culture of football suggests that success should happen, well, yesterday, shouldn't it? So patience is very, very thin amongst chairmen, but just as importantly amongst the fan base.
Yeah, I think so. I think the financial pressure that comes with football now is the cost base has increased across the four divisions, but the income hasn't stayed up to speed with that outside of the Premier League, and that brings a very, very special set of pressures on a manager, because you're basically only going to have 3 people that are successful out of 24 teams each season, and all 24 of them really need to go up just to break even. So that brings us its own pressures, and just the history of Forest that's weighed on some people, and it's culturally it's the same all over the country, I'm afraid.
Okay, so let's start with the first incumbent, the first gaffer to take the chair after Brian Clough departed, and that was Sir Brian's own recommendation. Frank Clark, now uniformly regarded as a club legend for having played, managed and then later chaired the club. He wasn't actually a manager before he took the hot seat at the City Ground, was he, Stephen? He was director of football at Leyton Orient.
Yeah, and he'd managed Orient for a while. He'd got a promotion from the 4th Division, but that really was as good as it got for him in terms of managerial achievements. I think he managed against Brian Clough as well in the FA Cup, sort of around 1988, so came up against Forest as a manager. But yeah, he'd been working like a director of football at Leyton Orient, and I imagine, I'm a little bit too young to remember Clark being appointed. I imagine it was a little bit of a surprising choice in some ways, given the lack of experience, certainly at top level of management. I would imagine that it would have been slightly different because it's Frank Clark, European Cup winner and a legend. So.
Actually, I mean, I think this is where I've got enough experience, shall we say, to... I remember being on my way home from school and hearing the press conference on Radio Nottingham as the new manager is Frank Clark, and like, who?
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say exactly the same thing. Out of the European Cup winning team, he was probably the least known of the players, because as we've seen down the years, he's a very quiet man, kept himself to himself, and it was really a case of Frank Hoof of many Forest fans of our generations, that we were sort of teenagers at the time, couldn't really remember having heard of him.
And
it was a big
also, you know, like you say, low profile since, but also he retired the year after they won the European Cup. So even for a lot of the fans who were around at that time, you know, our dad's generations, they'd have been like, oh yeah, was he the left back? Rather than thinking, oh yeah, Frank Clark, he was the left back. So it was a bit of a left field appointment. He was able to capitalise on some of the business that Forest had attempted to do previously, most notably the signings of Colin Cooper and Stan Collymore.
Yeah, that's certainly true, and also he benefited from keeping in structure the backroom staff. I think it's quite easy to forget how much of a part people like Liam O'Kane, Archie Gemmell, Alan Hill and Ron Fenton played in the last few years of Brian Clough's reign, when due to his health and various problems, they were basically running the club. If you hear the interviews of the players at that stage, the very intelligent thing he did at the time was not to change it at all. Really, he just kept that structure in place and benefited from their experience and know-how, and also the fact that we did have a very good quality squad at the time, even without.
So, in that sense, he was a very good choice, because as well as having a good footballing philosophy, which was obviously, you know, due in no small part to his experience as a player and his experience under Clough and Taylor, he was also a really solid administrator, and that is one of the things that helped the club make an early return. You know, it's a bit of a rocky start, wasn't it? The first few games, people going, "Oh, what's going on here?"
It was the first dozen or so games. He was under pressure because Forest hadn't started well.
And I remember a 3-1 defeat at home to Millwall, where the fans were, let's just say, it was not a happy place.
No, but he eventually turned it around. I think it was the signing of Dave Phillips, I think a few weeks into the season, which really sort of got the team going. He provided that sort of base of defensive cover, and he sort of, I don't know, by accident or by design, came across the 4-5-1 formation, which...
Well, yeah, and I think it's worth reminding our younger listeners that the transfer window didn't exist in the same way then, so he's able to sign Dave Phillips about 2 months into the season, and that freed up Steve Stone to become the right winger that we knew he could be. He also was able to sign during the season Lars Bohinen and Alf-Inge Haaland.
Yeah, and I think apart from the signings, his nature, the fact that he was such a calm man, really helped at that time as well, because it could have been very easy for a less experienced man, a more emotional man, to feel the pressure. But I think he exuded that calmness at all times, and I think that helped. That probably helped with the senior players in the club as well. Just having somebody who wasn't such a firepot character, who trusted them, and it was a very mature squad and a mature team in many ways.
Yeah, and the fact we were able to retain many of the playing staff in a way that relegated clubs rarely can do. I mean, obviously, Nigel Clough left, and that was really as much down to the off-the-field situation regarding the way his dad was treated. Roy Keane left, which wasn't a big surprise, but Stuart Pearce was retained, which was a big signing.
It was a big boost at the time, because he really encapsulated the club, and it's hard to sort of imagine a talisman at a club these days who was so identified with that club and was so close to the fans. I can't. It's hard to think of somebody.
And let's not forget that he'd not long been made England captain. So for an England captain to suddenly be plying his trade in the second tier of football, that's unimaginable.
It is, yeah.
That was one of the key things that Clark did when he got the job. He identified areas of the team, and he did what was required to strengthen. So, for example, Stan Collymore brought in up front because we needed a striker of quality. Colin Cooper at the back needed a good centre half after Des Walker left. Eventually, Coops comes in, and then getting Stuart Pearce to stay at the club as well. Obviously, Stuart Pearce's loyalty as well played a part in that, but Clark will have had conversations with him to persuade him to remain at Forest. And I think also Graham Taylor, who was England manager at the time, did assure Stuart Pearce that he would be still in his plans, even if he played in the second tier.
So we all know that Forest did go up in second place at the first time of asking, and then the next season was probably the most remarkable season in our lifetimes, I think. as Forest supporters.
Yep, it's just it's a golden time, really, just littered with amazing memories of great performances. You think back to the early season home win against Sheffield Wednesday, when I remember just going home that night and watching it on Match of the Day. The guy with long curly hair jumping out from the Bridgeford end and hugging the Forest players, and it was just the win away at Tottenham, the 7-1 at Sheffield Wednesday, the
Manchester United match on Boxing Day.
Yeah, and it's an amazing time. It's just hard to imagine it was in the same club and in our same lifetime now.
Well, yeah, and of course the thing is, so people say that, in the Premier League era, in the Premier League era, Leicester winning the Premier League is going to be tough to beat, but in its own way, Forest finishing third that season was just as big an achievement, especially as they were straight from the division below.
And we only really brought Brian Roy in, I think
literally one signing.
One signing, and we were up against Moneybags Blackburn and Moneybags Manchester United. And we ran them close for the title. It was only the last couple of months of the season where we sort of fell away. Up until the new year, we were right up there with them. And we gave them a good run for their money.
And Frank Clark, again, that calmness. He did admit in the programme notes he was putting all his eggs in one basket by signing just Brian Roy. But, it's that thing of we were perhaps, it was a bit obvious we were overly reliant upon Stan Collymore for goals and creativity. So by having Roy in there, playing him as a striker rather than the left winger that everyone thought he was, it enabled the players like Bohinen and Wone and Stone to add a new dimension to their game.
Yeah, and even just going back a season, not all the signings are obvious ones. You look at the signing of Jason Lee. That was in the springtime of the promotion season. And Forest were really struggling to score goals at the time because Stan was injured a lot of the time. And you brought in Jason Lee, and we were like, Jason who? He was an unknown player from Southend. And he allowed the rest of the team to play. And just off-the-wall signings like that just showed a real knowledge of football and a real insight into how the team worked and what it needed.
I like the story of how we signed Brian Roy, or the background behind it, because Brian Roy's wife liked her fashion. And I suppose coming from Amsterdam and these metropolitan cities, being in Italy as well, where we signed him from Foggia, you're surrounded by that culture and that all that stuff that's going on. And she was very keen to be near London, but Frank Clark convinced her that Nottingham was only half an hour away from London. So that was a sweetener in getting Brian Roy to come and sign for Forest. But it worked, and it turned out to be an inspired move.
I noticed now that's now Brian Roy's ex-wife. I don't know if that's connected or not. But, and then the next season, it was a lot more workmanlike in its own way because Stan Collymore had gone. Frank decided to spend the money on 3 players. He signed Andrea Salenzi, less about him the better, Kevin Campbell and Chris Bart-Williams. And actually, in the latter 2, although it took Campbell a little while to find his fitness, but Campbell and Bart-Williams would prove to be crucial signings for Forest, not necessarily under Clark, but in the future. Forest got to the quarterfinals of the UEFA Cup, the last team from England who were in Europe. And in the league, they still managed a respectable 8th. It wasn't exciting, it wasn't pretty at times.
It was still good. It was still good.
We had a very long unbeaten run.
Yeah, I think we equalled beat the Premier League record at the time. I think it was 25 games, I think it was. And we had a good FA Cup run as well. I think, was that the same season we beat Tottenham away in the FA Cup on penalties?
Oh, yeah.
That was a snow game as well at home, wasn't it, that was called off when the blizzard set in.
And so, again, it was just good memories. Even the European run, it was just full of... We didn't play spectacular football that season, but it showed Clark's tactical.
And it showed Clark also grew up in the Clough and Taylor era, because that's how Forest played in Europe to win the blooming thing. To say, look, we're not going to outplay them, so let's just do the simple things well, and then when we get our chances, we've got to try and take them. And that's where Brian Roy came into his own, because he was in a position to actually try and capitalise on some of those opportunities.
There were still some good moments that season. There was early on a 4-3 win at Southampton. Forest in that spectacular yellow kit.
Yeah, again, the less said, the better.
There was a game at Liverpool as well where Paul McGregor tore them apart in the first half. I think Forest went 2-0 up in that game.
I think it was Boxing Day or something. And,
Yeah.
You were 2-0. It still haunts me. And you knew, even at 2-0, you knew we were going to get beat because we never won at Anfield, and it was just the most painful day. It still gives me nightmares that day.
And Stan scored as well, I think, for Liverpool in that one. So that was not good. But the European nights as well. Just good memories of that era. Even the Bayern Munich game where it ended was still a good night.
Yeah, the Bayern Munich game is still actually one of my favourite memories as a Forest supporter because, we got completely outplayed by the best team in Europe that year. But we went out with our heads held high.
And the atmosphere, when people say the atmosphere was electric, it really was. It was like sparking the atmosphere in the ground that night before the match. It was you could literally feel the electricity sort of bouncing off the place. And they had Papan, Klinsmann, Mateus, Andy Bremer. They had some of the best players. They had some of the best players of that
Oliver
generation.
Kahn,
And it was a flattering scoreline, I think, for Bayern in the end. I think we had them on the rack at times, even that night.
Yeah. But I guess that's the nature of European football, isn't it? I mean, if nothing else, we've seen enough matches where teams have run away with it. Just this season's Europa League final. And then it went wrong. But Frank leaving wasn't necessarily down to. It wasn't necessarily down to what was going on the pitch, even though Forest were in the relegation zone. But in his own words, he didn't want to be a turkey waiting for Christmas.
Yeah, I think we'd had a change of ownership by that stage, and the new Irving Scholar and Nigel Ray, they sort of indicated they wanted to bring in their own people. He knew the writing was on the wall. It was a controversial sort of time at Forest, but
we're all a bit uneasy because the previous structure of the way the club was run had been ripped up. We knew that Frank was going, and rightly or wrongly, I mean, these days it would be a no-brainer because if you have a bad run of results, then you're out anyway. But it was still sort of fairly unusual then, and that brought in a caretaker in Stuart Pearce, club captain. With DaveHarryBassett coming in as general manager, who, as we've alluded to in another one of our podcast specials, signed one Pierre Van Hooijdonk. And you can listen to that on our feed. Let's skip over Stuart's caretaker reign because after a good start, it led to the inevitable relegation. And let's move on to DaveHarryBassett taking over as manager. What was it that he did when he came in that meant Forest was set up to go up that season?
He used his experience of what was then Division 1. He'd managed plenty of teams at that level before, Sheffield United, Wimbledon, and Crystal Palace as well. And he's a successful manager at that level. So he just knew what was required to make Forest a strong, difficult team to beat in that league. And he was lucky as well he did the right thing, if you like, keeping hold of big players like Steve Stone, Scott Gemmell, Bart Williams, Cooper and Chettle at the back, even Van Hooijdonk, who cost a lot of money, and Campbell up front. He kept those key players together so that Forest, when the season came around, had a strong squad ready to go.
And tactically, he was old school in the sense of he knew that with the addition of Alan Rodgers instead of Stuart Pearce, he knew that the back four and goalkeeper, that there wasn't too much to worry about there. So he focused upon attacking.
Yeah, and he was just a consummate manager. He just knew what had to be done. He just had great knowledge, great experience, great contacts.
He made it look easy, didn't he?
He made it look easy. And there was a lot of people who were mistrusting of him when he came in. He had a reputation for being a long ball manager and those sort of things. But it wasn't necessarily true. He was just a manager who knew how to win. And some of the football that team played was very, very good.
Okay.
He did make some good signings as well, just on that. Jeff Thomas.
Yeah.
Andy Johnson came, he was good. And
even some of the John Olafjelde, no one had heard of him. Thierry Bonnelau, I remember being at the first match that season away at Port Vale and going, who's that playing at right back? Because we didn't know. We didn't know who he was. So, those were less high profile signings. You know, they weren't £1 million signings; they were like a couple of 100,000. But they were the bedrock of having a successful squad that season.
And Mark Crossley had gone through. He had a little bit of a slump, didn't he? I think it was around when Clark was in charge, and that difficult relegation season. We started the following campaign with Marco Pascolo, who was a summer signing, Swiss international keeper. Didn't really convince, and so Bassett went out and got Dave Besant on loan from Southampton, and I think eventually turned that into a free transfer, which turned out to be a great signing because of that experience.
And again, Dave Besant also made it look easy, and of course he knew Dave Bassett really well from their Wimbledon days. So is just a great way of strengthening the squad in the places that it needed strengthening. Also getting the most out of players. Chris Bart-Williams is a left winger. He himself said he didn't like playing left wing, but he was so effective out there, wasn't he?
He was, yeah. He had a brilliant season, and still, it's just. You had players like Scott Gemmell in there as well, who really performed well.
On paper, we should have had a good squad and we should have been doing well, and we actually made a reasonable start in the first 2 or 3 matches of the Premier League season.
Yeah, well, it was all down to Pierre Van Hooijdonk going on strike, unfortunately. The club hierarchy not keeping their promises to Bassett to back him with in spending and buying some recruitments. He had to sort of manage that season with one hand tied behind his back, and he couldn't manage it, I'm afraid.
And the whole thing, obviously, Pierre Van Hooijdonk was the big story there. Let's not forget that Nigel Ray had said that Dave Bassett's got a job here for life, and then he sacked him, 3 months later?
Having sold Kevin Campbell behind his back, practically while he was on holiday.
Leading to the Van Hooijdonk strike, as we discussed.
So it was all just it was just a catalogue of errors that culminated in the Van Hooijdonk strike. You know, Neil Shipley and Dougie Friedman up front instead of Campbell and Van Hooijdonk, and just a team just couldn't get going in that Premier League season. We went on a horrible run. I think it was something like 18, 19 games without a win. And it was a shame for Bassett because he didn't deserve that. He'd done so well to get the club back into the Premier League. He deserved a proper crack at it to see where that team could finish as a Premier League side. And it just never happened. And it was a great shame, really.
Okay. Dave Bassett was sacked. The club went for a high-profile, experienced manager in Big Ron. Now, I personally don't particularly want to talk about Ron Atkinson. I don't know if either of you have anything that you want to say before I move on.
Yeah, it didn't really have the desired impact that the club would have hoped at the time, but it had a few good performances and they went on a nice run at the end of the season, played some nice football, but it was more or less just a caretaker manager. I
was embarrassed when he came in as a manager, and that embarrassment didn't get alleviated, and I just remember thinking after Forest got beaten 8-1 at home by Man United, just thinking that wouldn't have happened under Dave Bassett.
Yeah, it's a fair point.
Okay. Stephen, anything you want to say about him?
It was his last job in management. Came in at Forest, and after we were relegated, announced that he was retiring to focus on his TV career, which of course went very well.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was. He could have been a firefighter like he'd done at Coventry and Sheffield Wednesday. It just didn't happen for him at Forest. Wrong move for him. Wrong move for the club.
Probably quite an expensive move as well, because he also ended up leaving. He made a lot of loan signings, but then players like Carlton Palmer were on big contracts, which is only worth it if it keeps the club up, and it didn't. So the next incumbent in the hot seat was one David Platt, which was an exciting signing.
It was at the time. Former England captain, been playing with Arsenal, all the experience from massive clubs in Italy. I think at the time he was the most expensive player in world football in terms of cumulative transfer fees, and he had nothing but a good reputation just as a person and as a man. He was I suppose a modern day version with Frank Lampard. It was like everybody liked him. He was a nice clean cut young man. Achieved everything in the game, and it seemed like a no-brainer that he would be successful at management.
And after he retired from playing, he spent the next year, before he became the Forest manager, doing what he would call his, earning his stripes, I suppose, in management. He went around the clubs in Italy that he'd been to. He went around world football, and he kind of learnt lots about coaching methods and different ways of management. So on paper, it should all have worked out quite nicely, shouldn't it?
Should have done, yeah.
Okay.
He was very young though. He was 33 when he got the job,
Yeah.
which is a very. I mean, we talk if you get a manager below the age of 35 now, it's a bit of news because he's probably the youngest manager in the Football League, and it's a little bit of a story. For David Platt to be 33 and taking on the Forest job, it's easy to say now, but it was a big ask for him to come in. It had been a big ask for any manager, really, given where the club was, but especially for a 33-year-old with no experience.
You can see why the club hierarchy might have thought, you know what, we've got an England captain here. He can handle some of the big names there because he's handled them as a player.
Yeah, I mean, on paper, it looked like a decent appointment. He seemed to have lots of knowledge, and he always spoke very intelligently when he was interviewed before he got the job, and it just didn't work out.
Unfortunately, the first thing that he did is going to be the thing that he'll be most remembered for. He signed Gianluca Petracchi, Moreno Manini, and Salvatore Matricano, and out of those, none of them really succeeded in any way. There was flashes of promise with Matricano and Petracchi, but they never really settled in. Manini was a dead loss. It just goes to show you can't just transport someone from Serie A and then just drop them into the English Championship.
Yeah, I mean, in those days, maybe even more than now, it was a rough and ready league. I mean, you can say the football's improved in the Championship in the years that have since passed, but in those days, it would have been even more physical. And it was a big ask. It must have been a complete culture shock for them coming into.
But also, it's worth remembering that when Platt he was signed as player manager, and when he gave himself a start, he got sent off in his first match. So maybe the rough and tumble of the Championship was a shock to him as well. Having been used to playing refined football in Italy, playing for Arsenal when they were in the early days of just starting up Wenger ball. It was one of those things whereby it might just have been too much for him. And then I think that he lost confidence in his own tactical acumen. He tried too many different formations, too many different tactics with players who probably weren't up to it.
He spent a lot of money as well.
But some of those signings were actually decent signings. So if you look at players like Ricky Shimaka, who went on to have a couple of years of really good level of performance. Jim Brennan as well. Stern John, who, it went wrong in terms of that he had to be sold or had to be got rid of for financial reasons, but that was a decent signing at the time. He signed David Johnson, who didn't do it under Platt, but then ended up being an important player for Forest in the future.
Yeah. So he just couldn't get the results, and that was the main problem. I
remember my brother saying that one of the nails in the coffin was when he played Chris Bart-Williams at right back in a match against Ipswich, and you're just going, this guy hasn't got a blooming clue what he's doing.
He played as sweeper, didn't he, under Platt? He had a run where he was the best player in the team.
Yeah, and he did really well in the middle of a back three, because he had the kind of skill and confidence to bring the ball out from the back. But he also played him as an orthodox centre back. He played him played him every position in the park, and you can't just do that without having a plan. And that's the thing. It looked like he was doing that to fill gaps where he couldn't think of, where he didn't have confidence in other players to do those things.
No, I mean, the second season was better than the first. First season we finished 14th, and I think we might have been closer to the relegation spots than playoffs or promotion, which for a team that has just come down from the Premier League really wasn't very good. Second year it improved, and I remember we were in with a shout of the playoffs up until about the last month or two of the campaign, and then fell away into 11th. And I think people had just had enough of Platt by that point. And I can remember his final home game in charge against Gillingham, and I just remember people staying behind at the final whistle purely to boo Platt off the pitch.
Apart from that, he did all right. It was a blessed relief for most Forest fans when England came calling. I don't think everyone was going, that's worked out all right.
That's exactly what I was thinking. The word was relief. I remember getting home from work that afternoon when the news broke, and then we texted each other, and we were like, thank God for that. It was a relief. And we just...
And we were also excited by the new manager, who was promoted from within, Paul Hart. Because we'd started to see some of Paul Hart's academy players. Paul Hart already had the big reputation, having overseen the development of many of the players who were doing really well for Leeds at that point, and when Leeds were one of the better teams in Europe. And then we'd start to see some of those players coming through. So Jermaine Genius, Andy Reid, Michael Dawson, I think, had made his debut by that point. So it's really exciting to see, and also to see an approach by the club which maybe suggested there's going to be a unified kind of one club vision.
Yeah, it was very exciting, and just I think what encapsulated it all was the very first game. It was at home against Sheffield United, and the football played on that day was just the best football I've ever seen a Forest team play. It was like
they were just playing with freedom, weren't they?
It was just like a dawn of a new era. It was like Ajax, Barcelona, everything rolled into one and put into the City Ground pitch on the first. They were playing out from the back. They were passing it around, passing it in triangles, passing it around the Sheffield United players. They didn't know what was happening, and we were just creating chance after chance. But we just, unfortunately, in typical Forest style, conceded a late equaliser.
Yeah, I was going to say, you don't see Ajax or Barcelona conceding a goal to Paul Devlin.
Yeah. But it was just like a hallelujah moment. It was like we were in dream world. We couldn't believe that this was happening, and we were playing such beautiful football, and it was happening at Forest.
Now, let's not deny it, okay? So that season ended up being a bit of a slog in the end, because you couldn't keep going like that, and there were times where the lack of squad size, the fact that Forest had to make cutbacks, so Bart Williams had to go, Stern John had to go eventually, Johnson wasn't able to play. He was loaned out a couple of times, if I remember rightly. So there were all those players who had to go. And so we had a very young and not very big squad. And that's probably what put paid to that first season. The second season, though, that footballing philosophy really showed through, where Forest were playing with this diamond formation, with Ricky Shimaka protecting the back four, the full-backs bombing forward. If you think about, you look at your Man Cities now, that was breaking the mould. When consider this is in 2001, 2002.
Yeah.
It was years ahead of its time.
It was, yeah. And it was such a joy to watch, and it made you so proud to be a Forest fan. You sort of proud to tell people you're a Forest fan. And everybody was sort of asking about Paul Hart, and it was great times. It really was.
It was just superb. You went to games and enjoyed every single one. Even if Forest didn't win, you came away entertained, but...
Actually, and there were a few games, let's be honest, where the performance level wasn't quite there, whether down to fatigue or injuries or whatever, or just the way the opposition were playing. When Forest was starting to get found out, I remember we went to an away match at Reading, and it was a bit pedestrian. Yeah. But even then, you knew that the philosophy and the way in which the togetherness of the players and the squad and the management was enough to kind of basically worth an extra point or two. In terms of where Forest were going to get to.
And every player in that team had a key role, and they all played their part in being... As individuals, they were all brilliant through the season, and as a team, it just all came together. You look at Jim Brennan, who was on a different level. He was fantastic at left-back. Louis Jean, equally as good. Walker and Dawson at the back. The young lad breaking through with the experience of Des. That was a fantastic partnership. And I loved Dawson when he came in. He was just brilliant. He was strong. He had that robust side of his game, but he could come and bring the ball out and spray it around. And
wasn't like any other defender we'd seen at that point, was he?
No. Right. And then you go into the midfield, and obviously Shimaka was key. Gareth Williams, Andy Reid, just brilliant on the ball. Signing Darren Huckabee seems to take us to a new level as well. I just remember being so happy when we signed Huckabee, because Nottingham lad, proven championship player, and he just really he just took a little bit extra, added a bit extra to that team. You think of the 3-0 against Derby where we just tore them apart.
And if you think about it, just you going through those players, now obviously there's a few exceptions, such as the likes of Jack Lester, for example, but actually beyond that, pretty much every single one of those players ended up playing in the Premier League for a spell,
That's true.
with varying degrees of success, and that's not to be sniffed at, is it? That's a sign that not just in terms of their ability, but their mentality. There was something very right in there. However, my brother and I have a theory that after Michael Dawson's red card in the first leg of the playoff semi-final, which I have long categorised as harsh but fair, the Forest didn't agree. They wanted to appeal it, and they weren't successful in their appeal. And I think that it was a mistake to put John Thompson in ahead of John Olafjelde in defence in that second leg, because I think that little bit of extra... Thompson was very inexperienced at that point, and I think that little bit of extra nous and like... Bearing in mind that John Olafjelde was like a burly, no-nonsense centre-half, that might have made the difference in a match like the one we had at Bramall Lane, which ultimately ended in tears.
It might have done.
We'll never know, obviously.
No, but you remember that Forest were 2-0 up and cruising, and then a deflected free kick from, I think it was Michael Brown, got them straight back into the game at 2-1.
Yeah.
And then they just threw strikers on, and it proved too much. I remember...
Which is part of the reason I've got this theory that extra know-how and experience and so on might have made a bit of a difference. But anyway.
I've got a feeling it might have even been Des Walker who was turned inside out by Paul Pescasolido, who, by the way, he's just one of those players who I'll say the word hate. I know it's a strong word, but he just had that knack of scoring big goals against Forest. When you think,
I'm sure we say that about every striker,
and every Sheffield United player at that time was a despised.
Yeah, it's true.
The horrible, spiteful character, and they just used to think of Brown.
Yeah.
I remember Dean Windass. He should have got sent off in that first leg. And I think that's what made me more angry about Michael Dawson's red card. Because although that was harsh but fair, Windass went right through the back of Jim Brennan after about 5 minutes, and the ref just goes, might be a yellow.
Yeah, Clattenburg. I still haven't forgiven him.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's who it was. So, surprise.
There.
Yeah. Okay,
and
so...
then you've got players like Steve Cabot. He scored a ridiculous volley where he's like juggling the ball in the air and then volleys it. You know, these moments like that where the game just swung so in Sheffield United's favour. Poor Des, puts into his own net. But then people forget that we scored after that.
Yep.
Kjelder put the ball in, and there was still a couple of minutes left. And I think it might have even been Kjelder again, had a
Mathieu
header.
Louis-Jean.
Or was it Louis-Jean? Had a header that was saved on the line or something. You know, Forest was so
the
close.
one player on the pitch who was least likely to score, unfortunately.
Yeah,
but
it was just such a sad end for that team and for that season.
The abiding memory is the fact that seeing the sort of level of distress on the Forest players as they left the pitch. I think David Johnson is the one that will stick in the memory because he was just bawling his eyes out, walking with his shirt off.
I'm not proud of this now because I'm a more mature person, but I took that defeat as if I would take a death. I was inconsolable. The next day I was at work and I just couldn't function at all. Looking back at it, I'm not proud of that now. I shouldn't have reacted so badly to a football match, but it really hurt.
But for me, the overriding image has got to be it was a shot, a photo. It might have been a still from the TV pictures, I don't know, but of Des walking with his head down. It was from behind, Des walking with his head down and Paul Hart like giving him a big bear hug.
Yeah,
and that's like when you see a man of Des Walker's stature just reduced to that. It was one of the most devastating experiences as a Forest supporter that I think we've, even more so than the relegations we'd had. And stuff,
that was easily the most painful night of being a Forest fan for me.
Anybody who watched that team will have been just so emotionally invested.
Absolutely.
In what they were doing, in that group of players, the manager, everything was there for that, for that real emotional connection to that team and what they were doing at the time. So when it all went wrong like it did at Bramall Lane that night, it was crushing.
Well, you talk about going wrong, Kay. The common narrative is that Nigel Doughty pulled out the rug from under Paul Hart's feet by not investing in the team. Now, I think there's possibly a bit more nuance to that, which is that when you don't go up and you've got players, it wasn't uncommon for clubs to have a thing of like, players will get to the end of their contract and you're not going to get them to sign. But Schumacher, Brennan and Huckabee all went. And they went to the Premier League, and when Forest didn't go up, you can't really blame them for doing that, can you? Now the trouble is that the players who they were replaced with were Danny Zonner, what was his name? Gudjonsson, Good Johnson?
I can't remember.
There was a good Johnson who came
Yeah,
in.
yeah.
Davy Oyen, I think, came in at left
Davy
back.
Oyen, okay.
I've blanked out that period. I can't remember any of these names.
Yeah.
and Paul Hart, and then so the fluency of the football went. Again, he lost confidence in his own tactics. He tried to go to a flat midfield four, that didn't work. He tried to go back to the diamond. The players couldn't cope with that because they weren't good enough.
Yeah,
and Gareth Williams was the other one who went. Sorry,
yeah, he went to Leicester, didn't he? And and the season started okay. I remember we beat Sunderland, who'd been relegated from the Premier League, beat them at home. I think Louis Jean scored a header. Off the top of my head, he might well have done.
Oh well, I take it back. He was able to
rambling. And then there was a game at home, Sheffield United. Here we go again. David Johnson broke his leg in front of the Trent end. So we lost Jono for months. I think he did come back later that season, but he was out for a long time. Gareth Taylor was brought in. I've got nothing against Gareth Taylor, but he was a bit of a beanpole.
He looked like a good signing at the time. He'd been scoring goals for Burnley before he came.
Yeah, he had a good record.
I mean, we were fairly positive when he started.
It just didn't seem to suit that team and what that style was at the time.
And I think, really, on the subject of strikers, though, so David Johnson breaking his leg was a big, big moment. But then also the odd decision, and this was, by all accounts, very much a Paul Hart decision, was letting Marlon Harewood go and then signing Marlon King as his replacement for twice the money. So, as I say, regardless of what the direction of the club was in terms of, right, we haven't gone up, we need to cut our cloth accordingly. But then to spunk twice the money you've on your main established striker in the absence of David Johnson, to let him go to a Premier League club and then use twice that amount to buy a player who, frankly, wasn't as good. Marlon King had talent, but we all know about his head and his mentality from his off the pitch shenanigans. So that was really, to me, I think that was really the final nail in the coffin.
Yeah, and with hindsight, I think signing Huckabee might well have got Forest out of a hole had he come in during the pre-season after the playoff year.
Well,
but again, the story is with Paul Hart that he didn't want to sign Huckabee. He was offered Huckabee, but he said, "I want to do it with the kids."
Yeah,
or words to that effect. So,
and then when the chance came up to sign Huckabee for £750,000 midway through the season, Norwich got him because Huckabee understandably went, "Well, you had the chance." So that is a version of events. So I think it's worth pointing out this is pieced together from various sources.
Pure hearsay.
So, I'm sure that there may be other people who were closer to the scene at the time who may want to say their own bit. So Paul Hart ended up having a really bad run. Forest were in the relegation zone and he got sacked. And given the way the football landscape was in February 2004, it wasn't a big surprise because we were now in the era whereby it only took a few bad results.
I was still surprised. I remember saying to my brother, "God, he's ruthless, isn't he?"
But I also remember what those post-match interviews were like with Paul Hart in the last month or so, where he was just being really, really stubborn, bordering on unpleasant, and he just had that absolute conviction that he was right, or at least that's what it came across as. And people who've players and stuff who've been interviewed since say, yeah, that's one thing about Paul Hart. He's absolutely convinced about his way of doing things. So in that case, I can see why Nigel Doughty might have lost confidence in him.
Yeah.
And who was the replacement? One JFK, Joe Flippin Kinnear, which actually worked well in terms of keeping Forest out of the relegation mire that half season, because he just said, right, let's go back to a simple 4-4-2. He got in wingers. He got Alan Rodgers back to play on the left, Andy Impey to play on the right, played to Gareth Taylor's strengths. It was enough to rescue Forest, but giving him the job long-term was clearly a mistake.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
in hindsight, at
the time, I mean, people would have criticised the appointment because they would have said, "Oh, ex-Wimbledon manager." But Wimbledon were a good team under Joe Kinnear. They punched well above their weight, and they played some decent football in the Premier League. So I, for one, remember being relatively positive about his appointment.
Well, and it was hard to not give him the job after the run that Forest went on. He didn't just get them out of relegation trouble. He dragged them kicking and screaming up the league. I think Forest, having been in the bottom two, they were definitely in the bottom three, They finished 14th in the end, which was a real turnaround. So,
and showed some real promise. And that's the thing. Like he got the best out of kind of average players. Like remember Paul Evans? He was barely even a footballer.
£25,000
from Bradford City. I remember Paul.
Yeah,
Evans,
and I remember you saying he looks like a brickie or something.
Yeah, but he became a really important player. He passed the ball, did all the simple things well.
Yeah, and that's the thing is that. So I agree with you. Is that it was hard not to give him the job. Now, one thing that's interesting is that recently, I don't know if you heard as part of the 40-year European Cup celebrations, there's an interview on Radio Nottingham with Brian Appleby, who was the chairman who gave Brian Clough the job.
Yeah.
And he just said, bless him, he must be really, really old now, but he was just
90s,
going... Yeah, and he was just going, my job as chairman was to just... whatever the manager wanted, make it so that he could do... because I'm not a football man, I let the man who's a football man do the job. And I think that's what Nigel Doughty really wanted to do most of the time. He wanted to stay... You know, he didn't even allow his picture to be taken for years, did he? He didn't want to be... He was like the silent chairman for a long time.
Well, yeah, you do have to remember, he was the head of like a multi-billion-pound corporation, so Forest was a very small part of his life, really. He had... far bigger responsibilities going up in...
And going to the football, for him, was that escape. It was his leisure, wasn't it? Which is why he wanted to retain his kind of low profile. So he wanted, as chairman, most of the time, to just kind of say, look, you're the manager, you go off and do what you got to do. Joe Kinnear came in, he did what he had to do, not in a very big budget. Why wouldn't he give him the job longer term? Unfortunately, the other thing that happened that summer was that Capital One, as the club sponsors, sent Forest on a disastrous tour of the US as a part of their pre-season commitments. And I think that it tipped Joe Kinnear, whose mental health is clearly unstable, over the edge, because he just lost the plot, didn't he?
Yeah, there was a talk of players having to sleep in college dorms with like, bunk beds and things and not staying in proper hotels and... yeah, and I think it just put a dampener on preparations and created divisions in the squad and resentment from Joe Kinnear, which
never
really wore off. No.
Okay, and so with Forest once again in deep trouble. So just to add some stats to this. So Frank Clark had a win percentage of 41%. He had 178 games in charge and won 73 of them. DaveHarryBassett had the best win percentage of the managers that we've talked about in this podcast so far. 77 matches, 30 wins. David Platt had 35.9% and Paul Hart had 31.1%, which is lower, but consider that the club was going through a time of change at that point. Joe Kinnear had 34.1% after 44 matches where he'd won 15 of them. And then in part 2 of this podcast, this Odyssey, we shall get on to one Gary Megson. Where can we go from here?